lecture won't be very much out of place. I took it seriously to speak about Icelandic spirituality. So at the very least it will be quaint and informative, I guess, like everything that comes from Iceland. But I would like to bring greetings both from the Association of Ordained Women in Iceland, Félag Prestvíðra Kvenna, and from Bishop Solveig, Bishop Agnes, and Bishop Christian in Iceland, the three bishops we have. Sorry, I'm bringing greetings from Iceland. You can see here, this is a rural setting, the old seat of the main church in Iceland, or main cathedral, Skálholt. It's no longer, it's quite rural now, but you can see the person speaking there is Bishop Agnes, who is the Bishop of Iceland. Iceland is one diocese. Well, it is an interesting challenge to come here and talk about Icelandic spirituality. You will notice that I defined my lecture a little wider than Lutheran spirituality, more like spirituality in general, although the bulk of it will of course be about the faith and spiritual practices of largely, if only nominally, Lutheran people. And I have two reasons for this. One is that until fairly recently, being Christian and being Lutheran was almost synonymous in Icelandic consciousness. As a matter of fact, it went further. My colleague Toshiki Toma, who moved to Iceland in the 1980s, but is from Japan, he frequently said that Icelanders didn't really make a distinction between being Christian and being Icelandic when it came to faith and tradition. And in the absence of any major church denomination that had a strong and numerous presence, apart from our church, being Christian was basically being Lutheran. Of course, defining it this wide can also be tricky. I mean, how wide do I want to cast the net? Icelanders are, for example, known by many for their belief in elves. Belief so strong that we changed our plans for roads. We still do this. We change our plans for roads if there is an elf stone in the way and the elves are making it difficult. Or alternatively, we get a medium to talk to the elves. I'm always slightly suspicious of that. And, and convince them to move so that we can put the road here. Less known is the fact that spiritualism is the belief that we can contact our loved ones beyond grave. That was introduced in Iceland partly through the church and as part of Christianity. It was supposedly the proof that there is eternal life. This was especially prominent during the middle of 20th century in Iceland, but it is still found, as I will explain later. And thirdly, we are probably much less known, except perhaps among Nordic scholars of religion, for our belief in God. But the truth is that the percentage of Icelanders who believe in God is consistently higher in Iceland than in other Nordic countries. So Icelandic spirituality is closely connected to being Lutheran, and at the same time it can be defined much more broadly, both as Christian spirituality and a more open definition of spirituality. So perhaps the question is more, how do I approach this? Am I going to take a more normative approach, define Lutheran spirituality and then look for the signs, or a more descriptive approach? And my method is to take a more descriptive approach, look at what the people believe and say this is largely influenced by Lutheran traditions and Lutheran teachings. I am going to use statistics. Of course, we are limited in terms of studies are not always comparable, and sadly we lack very recent in-depth studies. But I will nevertheless use what we have, and I think it will give us a good picture. I'd like to begin by explaining how I define spirituality, I really like what Astrid was saying about Luther, faith and spirituality. But I took a longer way. Norwegian theologian Steinunn discusses different ways of defining spirituality in her recent book on a new old spirituality. And she uses this circle, which is actually from an American theologian. And as you can see, it displays how we're talking about the widest circle is religious and non-religious spiritualities, sort of a very wide, open thing. And then religious spiritualities and Christian spiritualities, which of course can be divided into different denominations. And I'd like to use these circles to outline how I approach this subject. A very wide definition can be found, for example, from the European Association of Palliative Care, which says that spirituality is the dynamic dimension of human life that relates to the way persons, individual and community, experience, express, and or seek meaning, purpose, and transcendence, and the way they connect to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, to the significant, and or to the sacred. As you can see, this is a very wide description, wide enough to encompass existential feelings or experience that is not necessarily of strictly defined religious nature. For example, our connection to family, to nature, and to its meaning. In the innermost circle, I am using Kaufmann's definition, which is the way in which a person experiences the relationship to God and nurtures and expresses his or her faith with special emphasis on the Christian practice. So of course I know that borders can be blurred between the different definitions, but this is sort of the way that I am approaching the matter at hand. When we look at Lutheran spirituality, Kaufmann defines it as theory-laden, with emphasis on certain doctrines, such as justification by grace and confessional writings. I would say that the key concept is grace, and if spirituality is the way in which a person experiences the relationship to God, then within the Lutheran tradition, that relationship is always there because God reached out. It is our response to God's grace. We are in God's presence because God reached out to us. I think that is important. When discussing Icelandic spirituality, we will go from the widest sense of religious spirituality down to statements of belief and how they are exemplified. So I'll start quite wide, and I will actually start with Elves. Last summer I visited an area in North Iceland where I stayed during spring as a child to help on a farm, help the ewing. Close to the farm there was a spot that always held great fascination. It was an elf village. Several rocks formed like houses and even one church. I think you can see the church on the picture. Whenever I walked there to fetch the sheep, my dog would growl a little bit as if he sensed something. I didn't really believe that elves or hidden people existed, but nevertheless I wasn't quite willing to let go of this possibility. It was simply much more fun if within rocks or mountains there was another world, often a world of riches and of people dressed in silk and finery. Stories of such richness abounded in the poor country that was Iceland in the late medieval and early modern time, and it was a great contrast to the life lived. And this village was the place in Iceland where I felt closest to the supernatural beings, perhaps the only place where I really thought they were. I want to make clear that there is of course a difference to believing in the existence of something such as elves, or believing in something like God, which has a much richer connotation and is really about relationship. But we still use the same words. So do Icelanders believe in elves? As you can see, we have a recent poll on that, which shows that, okay, the majority don't actually believe in their existence. Actually, well, only 1/3 believes that they are real, in the same way as a physical reality around us is. But as you see, women are more likely to say yes. And what is really interesting also is that in this poll you could see real differences between areas in Iceland. And this picture is from northeastern Iceland, and in that area 46% of those who replied said yes, they believed elves existed. However, the question was quite blunt. If it had been more subtle, I think results had been even higher in positive numbers. Because for most people, they like to imagine elves or other unexplained supernatural or spiritual forces, and that they could exist in some form. And they are reluctant to deny it entirely. I often quote our then Prime Minister in 1988 during the Gorbachev-Reagan meeting in Iceland, when he was asked by the foreign media, "Do you believe in elves?" And he replied, "My grandmother told me that she had talked to elves." I mentioned this belief in elves and what we call also the hidden people, that's part of our spiritual beings. It has been traced to pre-Christian customs and beliefs, including territorial spirits that protected certain areas. And I'm fairly certain that many of you can recite similar stories from your folklore. But what is interesting in Iceland is that if we read our folklore and our poems detailing interactions with these magical creatures, we notice that they sometimes seem to be Christian. They have churches, but the altar in their churches face west, not east, like our churches. There is a certain attempt to Christianize them as part of accepting the supernatural as part of our world. The poll that I cited here, I also asked if people believed in God, and as you can see, of those who say that they believe in God, 46% believe in the existence of elves as well. So people do not see anything wrong with that. So why am I talking about folklore as part of our spirituality? I mention it because I think there is a certain attitude apparent in how we handle this that I think I see also in other aspects of religious spirituality in Iceland, which defies being too tied to systems or creeds. It's a way of saying, I'm not saying this exists, but I will not deny it. It is a way of keeping options open. It is a non-systematic attitude. By the way, I visited the magical elf place village last summer. It really has changed. Global warming does that to you. Now it's all grown over. All these little hills that you see used to be just stones. They are now almost hidden with moss and saplings. It doesn't look the same anymore. And I think perhaps the elves have moved. Our folklore is full of stories of ghosts, good and bad. Of pastors fighting ghosts that do not want to rest in their graves, you might have the same. Very rural country up till the first half of last century, the darkness in winter and general isolation of the Icelandic countryside was the perfect playground for ghosts. Until the arrival of electricity, that is. That chased many a ghost away. But at the beginning of the 20th century, respectable citizens in Reykjavik formed a society to do a research on afterlife with the aid of mediums. Spiritualism is not an Icelandic discovery. Its origin is often traced to the Swedish mystic and theologian Emanuel Swedenborg, who died in 1772. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It was very popular in middle-class English-speaking areas at the turn of last century, and special spiritualist churches were founded. But in Iceland, what gave the movement special eminence is that the main proponents were extremely influential. One was the editor of the largest newspaper, another was a very well-known writer, and the third one was a professor of theology, ordained pastor, and extremely gifted preacher. Through the last one, spiritualism was presented as part of Christianity, and many students of theology and later influential pastors were affected. It struck a chord with the national spirituality and does so to this day, even if the teachings of the church has long changed on the matter, and we do not encourage spiritualism as such. In early 2004, a Gallup survey did a quantitative survey on religiosity in Iceland for the National Church, the Theological Institute, and the Reykjavik cemeteries. Some questions were partly or completely comparable also to an earlier survey from 1987 done by the university, and I am going to quote both surveys further later in my lecture. One question was about spiritualism, and it was framed as follows: do you agree or not agree that spiritualism and Christianity can be compatible? And as you can see, that almost 64% agree. I think, we can also say that it's possible that some of the respondents weren't quite sure what they were talking about. But this is nevertheless quite high number. It's even higher in 2004 than it was in 87. So let's now cross this fuzzy border of religious spirituality over to Christian spirituality and look for answers on the Christian faith and how people view and express their faith. The European Values Survey has included questions on belief in God, I think every time they do it. If we look at numbers from 1990 and 1993 from the Nordic countries, we can see that Icelanders affirm a much higher percentage of believing in God than other Nordic nations, despite some decline. You can see there, these 1990 and then 2008, that there is a decline, but we are still the highest of the Nordic countries. I mentioned the survey done by Gallup a little earlier. That survey was very comprehensive. It covered issues such as religious education and prayers and religious attitude in general and many other questions. It also asked about the service and role of pastors. And according to that service, almost 70% of Icelanders are religious. And some 75% of those who say they are religious state that they are Christian. And some 22% say they believe in their own way, in their own way. However, this high percentage of believing God, at least comparable to other Nordic countries, does not necessarily translate into high church attendance, even though that seems to be increasing slightly. We can see there again from the same years, this is church attendance, and if you look at Iceland at the bottom, it is the only one that has increased, but I think it might have something to do also with the years. Just after the financial crisis, there was some increase in church attendance. As I mentioned before, Iceland was a predominantly rural country until the middle of last century. I have maintained that church attendance has never really been general in Iceland. In the countryside, services were not held weekly, they still aren't, and churches were often far away. So if there was a service, somebody from each farm, one person, would attend church and then come home and tell the others about it. Most people attended once a year for communion. But Christianity and religious practice was nurtured in the home, with reading from Bible and from homily books, and with prayers. So Icelandic and Nordic surveys show that praying in the home with children is a tradition that has survived in Iceland. It's especially true of evening prayer. Oh, sorry, I have another. There you go. Sorry, okay, when speaking about spirituality and the way a person nurtures and expresses his or her faith, with special emphasis on Christian practice, I would like to focus on the prayers and the way that they signify for the individual and link to the image of God. And in this, I'm drawing on the work of Icelandic sociologist and theologian Björnsdóttir. Surveys on believing God from the last 2 decades quote a number of approximately 66% or up to 70%. The question is, what is the image of God that people believe in? And Björnsdóttir claims that the results of the 1987 survey showed that the majority of Icelanders had unclear and incoherent ideas on God, even if Christian religion formed a backdrop to these ideas. In the survey from 2004, a whole group is asked about which statement of God they agree with, and almost 40% agree with the statement, there exists a loving God to whom we can pray. And this is, people could agree with more than one statement. And 20% agreed with God must exist or life would have no meaning. And a portion of respondents agreed with there is no God but the one man has made, which would be the atheistic comment. They were also asked about Jesus. And as you can see, Jesus is the Son of God and Savior of man, which would be the sort of traditional Christian reply, is still the most common. We don't have any more recent surveys that ask similar questions, but Secular Humanists did a survey in 2015, and they show that 46% consider themselves religious, and 70% say that the statement closest to their belief is, I confess the Christian faith, which is still quite high, and this is in 2015. And it is evident from the survey that Icelanders are a nation that prays. 31% pray to higher beings daily or more often, as you can see. And what is really interesting is that the Lord's Prayer, again talking about our heritage, 30% of people say the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, daily or more. 30%, 1 to 6 times per week. And what I found particularly interesting when looking at this was that of those who never go to church, there's still a significant number that says the Lord's Prayer daily, and 43% of them more than once per week. And even those who do not consider themselves religious say the Lord's Prayer. I would also like to stress that quite a considerable number say that they believe their prayers have been answered. Pétursson has linked the active evening prayer with children, and oh sorry, I'm going to go a little bit, I'm doing this the first time with an iPad, so I got slightly confused here. According to these statistics that I have cited, Icelanders confess a believing God, a God that is loving, to whom they can pray, who answers prayers, and who gives answers in daily life. So that this is a God that gives them security and peace. And Peterson has linked the active praying to evening prayers with children, which is a custom that until recently seems to have been relatively strong in Iceland. He has also pointed out that Icelanders use hymns and verses in their prayers more than their Scandinavian counterpart, and he argues that the religious life of Icelanders is shaped by faith, which directly or indirectly is inspired in them as children, and especially with evening prayers. He describes the Icelandic faith basically as childhood faith. And I have to say, in my work as a pastor, I quite often meet people who say, I'm not particularly religious, but I still have my childhood faith. It's a very well-known concept, barnatrú. And this faith recedes when they grow up, but it resurfaces when they become parents. It's a faith that is a source of comfort and support in difficulties. Evening prayers link this faith, which in many cases is private, to the Christian traditions